Hey everyone, welcome back to the Salamander Wilds, and in this video I'm going to be discussing food for aquatic newts and salamanders. So this time around I decided to do a generalized discussion of this topic, and for the most part I normally don't like to do this because I like to be very specific and treat these animals individually according to their species. But in this case, most of the same rules are going to apply when it comes to food. So what I'm going to do, just like in my previous care guides, I'm going to be discussing foods that are not appropriate and foods that are appropriate. And I'll start off by discussing some foods that shouldn't be used as a food source. And while I could simply just go through a list of appropriate foods, I like to go through my due diligence and really give detailed examples of why certain foods are appropriate and others are not. And with that, let's dive into the discussion. So first, I'm going to go through a brief list of certain foods that are not only readily available, but realistically should be avoided as a potential food source. Now, the main reason to avoid the following food choices that I'm about to mention is because overall, they're just unhealthy food choices for newts and salamanders. But there's also a few other specific reasons that I'll be discussing as well. The first commonly available source of food that I will mention is freeze-dried foods. Freeze-dried foods such as freeze-dried bloodworms, tubifex worms, or perhaps even freeze-dried brine shrimp are often used for fish. However, many newts and salamanders will simply just reject this type of food. And while this type of food is readily available, the live versions of these foods or even the frozen versions of these foods are just simply much more nutritious. These freeze-dried foods are also usually meant for smaller animals and not for the adults. And so it doesn't really make sense to go out of your way to use this type of food source when the healthier versions are usually readily available in the same pet stores that this food is found. Another type of food source worth mentioning here is feeder fish. Fish such as guppies, rosies, or perhaps even small goldfish really don't make good food choices and should be avoided altogether. Feeder fish can lead to obesity in newts and salamanders if your animal is quick enough to catch them in the first place. Fish are usually too fast moving for most newts and salamanders to be able to catch. Feeder fish can also potentially introduce parasites, which would be dangerous to your newts and salamanders as well. And some fish can even be aggressive towards newts and salamanders, especially salamanders with external feathery gills. These fish would see those gills as a potential source of food as well. There's just too many drawbacks to consider feeder fish as a healthy and consistent food source. The next source of food that is worth mentioning here are pellet type foods. And I want to be really specific here because there is one other pellet type food that is actually recommended, and I will mention it later on. But for the sake of what I'm talking about here, the pellet type foods that should be avoided are generally not formulated correctly for newts and salamanders and are often also rejected by newts and salamanders as well. For the most part, pellet type foods are commonly found in most pet stores, whether it's Reptimin or some other brand. The problem is with most of these foods is that they actually float at the surface of the water. However, aquatic newts and salamanders do not eat at the surface, they eat at the bottom. So for the most part, these pellet foods will simply just go unnoticed by your animal. And if left in the water too long, they'll also foul and cloud the water. And as far as ingredients, a lot of these pellets are also formulated with corn or wheat and other unnatural ingredients. And so again, it really just doesn't make sense to go out of your way for a source of food that really isn't beneficial to your newt or salamander when there are just so many better choices out there. At this point, I'm going to go over some food sources that can and should be used for your aquatic newt or salamander. Now, unlike the previous section, the general idea here is that the following food choices are overall quite healthy for your newt or salamander. But, just like before, there are a few things worth mentioning. And as always, be sure to vary the diet of your animal in order to provide as many nutrients as possible. The first source of food worth mentioning, and perhaps the best choice of food, is earthworms. Worms are a newt and salamander's best friend. They are highly nutritious and readily accepted by newts and salamanders. They are especially great for newts and salamanders that may be shy about eating, that are still adjusting to their new environment. However, to feed these to your animals, you may have to chop these down to smaller, more appropriate sizes in order for your newt or salamander to be able to eat them. Typically, earthworms aren't usually available at pet stores, so you may have to go out of your way to a bait shop or some other location in order to acquire them. And while you can acquire worms outside from your garden, just make sure that fertilizers or other chemicals aren't being used. However, as a side note, the red wiggler variety of earthworms produce a foul-smelling liquid when cut, so your newt or salamander may reject these specific type of worms due to this. The next type of food worth mentioning is live blackworms. Live blackworms are usually not commonly available in most pet stores. You may have to go to a local pet store as opposed to a bigger chain store, or these can also be ordered online. But just like earthworms, blackworms are great in nutritional value, and they are readily accepted by many aquatic newts and salamanders. However, these worms are usually meant for smaller animals and not for larger newts and salamanders. The next food source worth mentioning is frozen bloodworms. Although they're not as nutritious as the previous foods just mentioned, frozen bloodworms are readily available in many pet shops and still make a really good choice as a source of food. And storage is quite easy, as they can just be stored in a freezer. And they're also readily accepted by most newts and salamanders. But as a side note, because these are frozen and not live food sources, these may not grab the attention of a newt or salamander immediately. The next type of food source worth mentioning is frozen brine shrimp. And there are two varieties here that are worth noting. The first variety is just simple frozen brine shrimp, which is not as nutritious as the previous foods that were mentioned, but it is commonly available in most pet stores. However, beyond nutritional value, some of the downsides are that this food choice does contain salt, and it may be refused by some newts or salamanders as well. But there is another variety of frozen brine shrimp, and that is spirulina frozen brine shrimp. And this is the variety that is definitely recommended, as it provides much more nutrition. These shrimp are fed spirulina algae, which is very high in carotenoids. Carotenoids are great for color development, which is especially effective for young newts and salamanders that are still growing. And of course, both varieties can be stored in a freezer for later use. The last food worth mentioning is something that I actually spoke about in the previous section, and that would be the pellet food that is actually recommended, which is soft sinking salmon pellets. These pellets are often used in salmon hatcheries, but are also very popular as a food source for axolotls. And, as the name suggests, these pellets sink to the bottom, making them an easy food source for your animal. That said, not all aquatic newts or salamanders may accept these pellets, and they may have to be cut to an appropriate size for smaller animals. And of course, be sure not to overfeed and clean up any leftover uneaten food because these will also foul as well. I'll also leave a link in the description for more information on these pellets. And with that information, I'm going to wrap up the video here. When selecting a food source for your animal, remember to always vary the diet in order to provide a variety of nutrients. But also, always do as much research as possible in order to make sure you're choosing foods that overall are healthy, beneficial sources of food. And again, this care guide is tailored towards aquatic newts and salamanders, so the food sources mentioned here are not recommended for terrestrial species. And if you enjoyed the video, please remember to leave a like, share, comment down below, let me know what you think, and perhaps if you have any food sources that you might recommend as well. And of course, please subscribe, your support is very much appreciated. And until next time, I hope you'll all join me for another adventure into the salamander wilds.